The Vanishing Place. There are places in the world that vanish loudly. Cities reduced to rubble by war, towns swallowed by rising seas, settlements abandoned after disaster, their ruins left as warnings. History remembers those places. But this story is not about a city that fell. It is about a city that was removed. There was no explosion, no evacuation order, no final photograph of destruction. One day the city existed, and then, quietly, methodically, it did not. Old government archives still whisper its name. Early census records list thousands of residents. Trade documents describe shipments moving through its rail lines. Letters reference streets, neighborhoods, cafes, and factories. On paper, it was real. But open a modern map and you will find nothing. No marker, no blank label, no indication that anything was ever there. Just ordinary land, fields, forest, or terrain so unremarkable it raises no questions at all. That absence is the first warning. The second is more disturbing. Everyone who claims to remember the city eventually disappears from official records. Not all at once, not dramatically. Their birthplaces are altered, addresses reassigned, documents flagged as clerical errors. It happens slowly enough that no one notices until they compare versions of the past and realize something no longer matches. The city cannot be visited. There is no route that leads to it, no coordinates that resolve to a destination. And worse, there is no definitive proof that it ever existed, only contradictions, maps that disagree with one another, archives that reference a place they no longer recognize, memories that belong to no one on record. This is not a story about a lost city. Lost implies it can be found again. This is a story about a city that resists being known, a place that seems to recede the moment attention turns toward it, a location that survives only in fragments until those fragments too are corrected. What happens when history edits itself? What happens when a city is not destroyed by time, but erased by design, or by something that does not want to be remembered? You can't visit it. You can't point to it. You can't prove it existed. All that remains is the silence where certainty should be, and the unsettling feeling that something important has been deliberately removed from the shape of the world. Chapter 1. A city that once had a name. Long before the city vanished, it existed in the most ordinary way possible. It was not hidden. It was not secret. It did not sit outside the attention of governments or institutions. In fact, the earliest traces of the city appear where historians trust the most: bureaucratic paperwork. In national census archives dated to the early decades of the 20th century, the city is listed repeatedly and consistently. It had an official name, spelled the same way across multiple documents. It was classified as a regional center, neither a capital nor a remote settlement, but something in between. Large enough to matter, small enough to be overlooked. Population figures varied by year, but they always hovered within a believable range. Tens of thousands of residents, families, workers, children, retirees. Nothing remarkable, except for how normal it all was. Tax records show municipal revenue collected from local businesses. Shipping manifests list goods arriving and departing through rail depots connected to the city's name. Employment registries reference factories, warehouses, and administrative offices located there. These are not the kinds of documents that appear by accident. They are created by different departments at different times for different purposes. For a city to appear across all of them, it must have functioned as a living system, administrative, economic, and social, and for decades it did. Archive correspondence between regional officials mentions routine matters: road repairs, school funding, sanitation issues, labor disputes. Nothing dramatic, no hint of instability, no warning of disaster. The city was never described as temporary. Old railway schedules place it as a stop between two larger urban centers. Passenger logs suggest commuters traveled through it daily. Freight records indicate it was a distribution point for agricultural goods and manufactured materials. Maps from the same period confirm this picture. Early cartographic surveys show a dense grid of streets radiating from a central district. Public buildings are marked, industrial zones outlined, residential areas carefully labeled. The city had neighborhoods, it had infrastructure, it had a rhythm. Even personal documents reinforce its existence. In preserved letters and diaries stored in private collections, the city appears casually, almost carelessly. Writers mention meeting friends there, visiting relatives, attending markets, complaining about weather, noise, and rent. These references are not nostalgic. They are not reflective. They are written as if the city would always be there. And that is what makes what follows so difficult to explain. Because somewhere between one decade and the next, the city stopped being mentioned. Not dramatically, not abruptly. At first, it was subtle. A census entry where the city's name is replaced with a broader regional designation. A shipping document that reroutes cargo through a neighboring city without explanation. A railway schedule that quietly removes one stop. No announcement accompanies these changes. No justification is offered. It is as if the city began to dissolve within the language of administration. Later records show something even stranger. Documents that once referenced the city are still preserved, but altered. In some cases, the city's name is crossed out and replaced by hand. In others, it is missing entirely, leaving blank spaces where a location should be. Some files include footnotes stating, entry corrected, location amended, clerical revision. Corrected to what? No alternative location is provided. By the mid-century, the city's name no longer appears in newly created documents at all, yet older records remain, existing in contradiction to the present. This creates a problem historians are trained to distrust: inconsistency without explanation. Cities do not simply stop being referenced unless something happens to them. Wars leave reports, natural disasters leave relief efforts, economic collapses leave migration data. But here, there is nothing. No evacuation orders, no emergency funding, no refugee movements. The population figures do not relocate, they disappear. People who should have been counted elsewhere are not. It is as if the city's residents were subtracted from history rather than redistributed within it. Even more unsettling is what happens when researchers attempt to follow individual lives. Take a single census record. A factory worker born in the city, married there, listed as residing in the same district for multiple decades. In later documents, that same person appears still alive, still employed, but their birthplace has changed. The city is replaced with a nearby town or a vague regional label. No amendment note explains the discrepancy. The past itself has been edited. This pattern repeats across hundreds of individuals. Birthplaces reassigned, marriage records relocated, death certificates listing origins that contradict earlier filings. The city is not acknowledged as missing. It is treated as if it never existed in the first place. Even its name becomes unstable. In some older documents, it appears spelled one way. In later reproductions of the same document, the spelling changes slightly. Then, eventually, the name vanishes altogether, as though removing it entirely required several attempts. Historians who have examined these records describe a peculiar sensation, the sense that they are looking at two overlapping realities, one in which the city clearly existed and functioned normally, another in which that same city is an administrative impossibility, and neither reality fully overwrites the other. The physical archives do not resolve the contradiction, they preserve it. Microfilm copies disagree with originals. Digitized records omit details present in paper versions. Indexes fail to match their own source materials. Every attempt to standardize the data makes the problem worse. At some point, researchers stop asking where the city went. They begin asking a more troubling question. Why does every system designed to preserve history seem to reject its existence? Because erasure is not simply the removal of information. It is the act of replacing certainty with doubt. By the time modern historians encounter the city, it exists only in fragments, isolated references without context, names without location, statistics without geography. The city still has a name, but that name no longer points to a place. It points to an error. And errors, by definition, are meant to be corrected, which raises a final, unsettling possibility. What if the city was not destroyed? What if it was revised? Not eliminated in a single moment, but slowly rewritten out of the systems that define reality. Maps, records, registries, and memory itself. A city that once had a name, and now exists only as a problem that history no longer knows how to solve. Chapter 2. The Maps That Don't Match. If written records were the first place the city began to unravel, Maps were where the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Maps are not memories, they are declarations. Every line, symbol, and label represents a decision: what to include, what to omit, what to name. Cartographers do not draw casually. A city appears on a map because multiple authorities agree that it exists, that it occupies space, and that others must be able to find it. Which is why the earliest maps showing the city are so precise. In late 19th and early 20th century survey maps, the city is clearly marked. Its name is printed in standard type, identical in size and style to surrounding towns. Major roads converge toward it. Rail lines branch out like veins. Rivers are redirected, bridges indicated, boundaries measured. The city is not annotated as temporary. It is not marked as disputed. It is not surrounded by warnings or qualifiers. It is treated as settled fact. Yet when historians began placing these maps beside newer editions, something unsettling emerged. The same region, mapped by the same agencies, no longer agreed with itself. A map printed only 5 or 10 years later shows the roads bending differently. A rail line ends prematurely or diverts toward another city. Where the city's name once stood, there is empty space, or worse, terrain features that contradict earlier geography. Forests appear where neighborhoods once existed. Agricultural land replaces dense urban grids. In some versions, a river runs directly through the area where the city center was previously marked, despite geological surveys showing no evidence of rerouting or flooding. At first glance, this could be dismissed as error. Maps, after all, are revised all the time. But the revisions here follow no rational pattern. When cities are removed from maps, the reason is usually obvious. A town destroyed by disaster may be marked as ruins. A settlement abandoned over decades might be downgraded to a minor label before disappearing entirely. That is not what happens here. The city does not fade, it is replaced, and replaced inconsistently. In one edition, the land is labeled as uninhabited. In another, it becomes state-owned forest. In a third, it is simply unlabeled, an omission so stark it draws attention to itself. Even more troubling is that these conflicting maps were often printed in the same year. Different departments, different print runs, different versions of reality. Some include the city, some erase it. None explain why. Cartographic archives reveal internal memos attached to certain revisions. Most are vague to the point of meaninglessness. Boundary alignment updated. Topographical correction applied. Administrative simplification. Simplification of what? No documentation describes a relocation, demolition, or consolidation. No legal act transfers land ownership from municipal status to wilderness. The maps change, but the law does not. In some cases, the contradictions appear within the same map. Street names that lead nowhere, roads that terminate abruptly in blank space, railway symbols without stations. A city that has been removed, but not fully cleaned from the cartographer's tools. One researcher described it as editing without understanding the original layout, as if someone had attempted to erase the city from memory rather than geography. The inconsistencies extend beyond paper. When satellite imagery became available decades later, researchers hoped the confusion would end. It did not. Modern satellite maps show terrain that should not exist according to earlier surveys. Elevation data contradicts historical measurements. Soil composition does not match decades of agricultural use recorded in trade documents. Even more disturbing are anomalies in alignment. When old maps are overlaid digitally with modern imagery, nothing quite lines up. Features appear slightly offset, as if the land itself has shifted sideways, not enough to be dramatic, just enough to be wrong. The city's supposed location falls into a zone of constant adjustment. GPS coordinates resolve differently depending on the reference system used. Mapping software disagrees with itself. The ground refuses to settle into certainty. Some cartographers have suggested mundane explanations: data corruption, projection errors, faulty conversions between coordinate systems. But those explanations collapse under scrutiny. Projection errors do not selectively erase one city while preserving others. Data corruption does not rewrite history consistently across multiple independent archives. Conversion mistakes do not persist across generations of mapping technology. And yet, the problem remains. The city appears and disappears depending on which map you trust. There is no single correct version. Attempts to identify the city's boundaries only deepen the confusion. Property lines shown in early cadastral maps have no modern equivalents. Survey markers referenced in documents cannot be located in the field. Some are missing. Others exist, but are mislabeled. In a few cases, markers are found in places where no boundary should be, as though the land has been reorganized without leaving instructions. What makes the situation more unsettling is how official responses handle these contradictions. When questioned, mapping authorities do not deny the discrepancies. They simply classify them as resolved. Later editions quietly adopt one version of the terrain and discard the others. Earlier maps are recategorized as outdated, unreliable, or superseded. No explanation is offered for why they ever differed. The act of choosing becomes an act of erasure. Once a map is declared authoritative, all conflicting versions become mistakes, and mistakes are ignored. But the earlier maps still exist. They sit in archives, libraries, and private collections, unchanged. Proof that another version of the land was once considered real. In some cases, the city's name has been physically removed from maps, not crossed out, not faded by time, carefully scraped away. Under magnification, traces of ink remain. The indentation of letters can still be felt on the paper. Someone took the time to remove the name without damaging the surrounding features. This is not standard practice. Cartographers do not erase cities by hand after printing, unless they are instructed to. Even more curious are maps that reference the city indirectly, legends that list symbols for a city that is not shown, indexes that include the city's name but point to blank coordinates, inset maps that contradict the main image. These are not mistakes made by amateurs. They are signs of a system working against itself. At some point, researchers begin to notice a pattern. The closer a map gets to being comprehensive, the more detailed and accurate it attempts to be, the less likely it is to include the city. Smaller regional maps are more likely to show it. Local maps reference it casually, but national and international maps erase it completely, as though the city is tolerated only at the margins of attention. This raises an unsettling question. What if the city cannot exist at scale? What if acknowledging it requires a level of specificity that larger systems refuse to allow? Maps are tools of consensus. They reflect what authorities agree is true. If enough institutions reject a location, it ceases to exist, not physically, but officially. And official reality is the only reality that matters. By the time digital maps dominate navigation, the city is gone entirely. Search results return nothing. Coordinates resolve to emptiness. Historical layers skip over the area without comment. The city has not been forgotten. It has been overwritten. The land where it once stood now belongs to something else. A forest, a field, a blank space between known places. And yet the old maps remain, silent witnesses to a version of the world that no longer matches the one we are allowed to see. They do not explain what happened. They simply prove that at some point, reality disagreed with itself. And when forced to choose, history sided with the map that showed less. Chapter 3. People who remembered. If the maps were wrong, then the people should have been right. Cities may be misdrawn, mislabeled, or revised, but memory, especially lived memory, does not vanish so easily. Streets may disappear from paper, but they remain in the minds of those who walk them. Buildings collapse, yet the shape of them survives in recollection. Names persist, carried quietly by those who were born into them. At least, that is what history teaches us. At first, there were witnesses. They did not come forward as part of any organized movement. They were not seeking attention. Most did not even realize that what they remembered was unusual until they were told it was impossible. An elderly woman interviewed for a regional history project mentioned being born in the city. She spoke of narrow streets, a central square, a factory that ran day and night. Her tone was casual, unremarkable. The city was simply where she came from. The interviewer paused. That city, according to official records, did not exist. Similar accounts surfaced elsewhere. A retired railway worker recalled transferring cargo through the city during his early career. He remembered the station layout, the surrounding warehouses, the smell of oil and metal. He could describe the route without hesitation. But when historians searched the railway archives, there was no record of a station at that location. The line existed. The schedule existed. The city did not. At first, these testimonies were dismissed as errors of memory. People misremember places all the time. Names change, towns merge, borders shift. But the details were too consistent. Witnesses who had never met described the same neighborhoods, the same landmarks, the same geographic relationships. They agreed on the city's location relative to rivers and railways, on the industries that sustained it, on the way it felt to live there. None of them spoke in grand terms. They did not describe a legendary place. They described an ordinary city. That paradoxically made their accounts more unsettling, because ordinary places do not inspire shared hallucinations. As researchers began to follow these individuals through administrative records, something strange emerged. Their testimonies existed, their identities existed, but their histories did not align. Birth certificates listed places that contradicted personal memory. School records referenced towns the individuals insisted they never lived in. Employment histories showed gaps that coincided precisely with the years they claimed to reside in the city. It was not that the records were incomplete. They were complete, but wrong. In several cases, earlier versions of documents told a different story. Archived paper records, when compared to digitized copies, showed discrepancies. A birthplace altered, a city name replaced, an address reassigned. The original ink told one version of the past. The later transcription told another, and the witnesses were always aligned with the older version. When questioned, authorities attributed the inconsistencies to clerical corrections, data standardization, human error, but the same pattern repeated too often to ignore. Every individual who remembered the city experienced the same administrative distortion, not erasure, reassignment. Their lives were adjusted to fit a reality where the city had never existed. More troubling still was what happened over time. As years passed, the witnesses became harder to find. Not because they died, though some did naturally, but because they vanished from systems. Addresses led nowhere. Contact information failed. Public records marked them as duplicates, errors, or unresolved entries. In some databases, their profiles still existed, but without history. Names without pasts, people without origins. One researcher described the sensation of searching for them as trying to hold on to smoke. Even when individuals could still be contacted, their own certainty began to waver. Interviews conducted years apart revealed subtle shifts in memory. The city's name became harder for them to recall. Street names blurred, timelines shortened, not dramatically, just enough to suggest erosion. Some witnesses began to second-guess themselves. Maybe it was a different town, they would say. Maybe I'm confusing it with somewhere else. Yet when pressed for specifics, the details resurfaced intact. It was not memory that was failing. It was confidence. The pressure of contradiction wears people down. When every official source tells you that your past is wrong, doubt becomes inevitable. And doubt, once introduced, spreads. Families noticed something else. Stories passed down through generations began to change. Grandparents who once spoke clearly about the city became quieter. Mentions grew rare. Names were replaced with vague references, that place, where we used to live before we moved. Not because they were afraid, but because the stories no longer fit. You can only tell a story so many times before realizing no one else recognizes it. Some families discovered that old photographs no longer matched official narratives. Images labeled with the city's name in handwritten notes now conflicted with modern databases. When descendants attempted to contextualize these photos, they found no supporting evidence. The images remained, but the place they depicted could not be identified. Like portraits of people no one remembered meeting. Even more disturbing were cases where witnesses attempted to document their memories formally. Written testimonies submitted to archives were returned with requests for clarification. Place names flagged as unrecognized, locations marked invalid. Some submissions were accepted, but with edits. The city's name replaced by a nearby town. Dates adjusted, references removed. The testimony survived, but the city did not. And then there were those who refused to revise their memories. A small number of witnesses insisted, quietly but firmly, that the city had existed. They refused to accept corrected documents. They kept copies of old records, maps, letters. They became anomalies. And anomalies attract attention. Their records began to fragment. Files duplicated incorrectly. Entries contradicted one another. Eventually, accessing their information became difficult even for themselves. Healthcare records failed to load. Employment histories showed inconsistencies. Identification documents required revalidation, not as punishment, as procedure. The system treated them as unstable data, and unstable data must be resolved. In the end, most witnesses did not disappear in any dramatic sense. They faded. Their stories stopped being recorded. Their names stopped appearing in research. Their histories were quietly harmonized with the official version of reality. Those who remembered the city were not silenced. They were corrected. And correction is far more effective than suppression. Because once corrected, a memory becomes unreliable, even to the person who holds it. By the time contemporary researchers became aware of the pattern, it was already too late. The generation that remembered the city directly was nearly gone. What remained were fragments, secondhand accounts, inconsistent documents, memories filtered through doubt. The city survived only in places where systems failed to synchronize completely. Old notebooks, private letters, marginal notes that had never been digitized. But even these were becoming harder to interpret. Without an official framework, memory loses authority. And without authority, memory becomes myth, which raises a final, deeply unsettling possibility. What if the city does not disappear because it is forgotten? What if it disappears because it is remembered? What if every act of recollection triggers correction? Not punishment, not retaliation, but adjustment. A process that quietly reshapes the past until no one is left who can contradict it. If that is true, then the people who remembered the city were not witnesses to a loss. They were participants in an erasure. And once their memories were neutralized, the city no longer needed to be removed. It had already been rewritten out of existence. Chapter 4. Attempts to find the city for. Once the contradictions in maps and memories became impossible to ignore, a more direct question emerged. If the city had existed, then it must have occupied physical space. Buildings leave foundations, roads leave scars. Human presence alters land in ways that persist long after names are forgotten. So researchers decided to look for the city itself, not in documents, not in testimonies, but on the ground. The earliest attempts were cautious and methodical. Independent historians and geographers compiled every surviving reference, old maps, railway schedules, land surveys, tax records, and overlaid them to estimate a probable location. The results did not align neatly. Each source pointed to a slightly different area. The city's supposed center shifted by kilometers depending on which archive was trusted. Boundaries blurred. Landmarks overlapped incorrectly. Still, there was enough convergence to identify a region, and that was where the first expedition went. What they found was ordinary. No ruins, no foundations, no abandoned infrastructure, just terrain, fields, forests, and uneven ground that showed no sign of dense urban occupation. Soil samples revealed no layers of construction debris, no concentrations of brick dust, no unnatural compaction consistent with long-term habitation. It was as if the land had never been built upon. At first, this was taken as evidence that the city never existed, but the explanation collapsed under closer examination. Historical records show decades of industrial activity, factories, rail depots, warehouses. These do not vanish without trace. Even deliberate demolition leaves debris, altered soil chemistry, or subsurface anomalies. None were found. The land was too clean. The second wave of investigations expanded the search area. If the city had been mislocated, perhaps it lay nearby. Researchers broadened their radius, checking adjacent valleys, riverbanks, and elevated ground. They found traces of human activity, small settlements, farms, roads, but nothing resembling a mid-sized city. And then the anomalies began. Equipment failures were the first sign. GPS devices lost signal or produced inconsistent readings. Coordinates drifted slightly over time, even when devices remained stationary. Mapping software failed to lock onto reference points. This was dismissed at first as technical error, until it happened repeatedly, across different devices, different teams, different days. Satellite imagery provided no clarity. High-resolution images of the region showed terrain that appeared subtly inconsistent between data sets. Seasonal changes did not account for the discrepancies. Shadows fell at angles that did not match elevation models. When analysts attempted to compare images taken years apart, the land seemed to shift, not dramatically, but enough to prevent precise alignment. Some researchers reported a sensation of disorientation while in the field, difficulty maintaining a sense of direction, confusion over distances traveled, time estimates that did not match recorded data. Again, these reports were treated cautiously. Fatigue, expectation bias, environmental factors, all plausible explanations. Yet the pattern persisted. The closer teams attempted to refine the city's location, the more unstable their reference points became. At one point, an archaeological team attempted ground-penetrating radar surveys. The results were inconclusive. In some scans, subsurface anomalies appeared briefly, suggesting foundations or buried structures, only to vanish upon resurveying the same area. The data could not be reproduced. Peer reviewers dismissed the findings as noise, but the researchers were unsettled. Noise does not behave consistently. Several teams attempted to locate the city indirectly. If the city itself left no trace, perhaps its absence had consequences. They searched for disrupted road networks, unexplained detours in historical infrastructure, regions where transportation systems seemed to bend around something that was no longer there. Patterns emerged: rail lines that curved unnecessarily, highways that diverted without topographical reason, utility corridors that ended abruptly or looped inefficiently. It was as if modern infrastructure had been designed to avoid a space it did not acknowledge. Even older infrastructure showed signs of redirection. Roads that once led somewhere now led nowhere. In interviews with local residents near the suspected region, responses were cautious. Most denied knowledge of any former city. Some insisted the land had always been empty. A few hesitated, then changed the subject. Only rarely did someone mention a place that used to be there. These mentions were vague, uncertain, quickly retracted. No one could provide details. No one wanted to. More unsettling were the accounts from individuals who attempted to stay near the suspected location for extended periods. They reported disrupted sleep, a persistent sense of unease, difficulty recalling why they were there. Notes taken during fieldwork were found incomplete, missing pages, or written in ways the authors did not remember composing. In one case, a researcher returned home with hours of GPS-tracked data missing, without any indication of device malfunction. The investigation was paused, officially due to lack of evidence, unofficially because the effort was becoming impossible to justify. Every attempt to find the city produced either nothing or contradictions that could not be resolved. The city did not resist discovery by hiding. It resisted by refusing to stabilize, by never allowing itself to be located with enough certainty to be proven. At some point, researchers began to reconsider their assumptions. What if the city was not gone? What if it was inaccessible, not physically unreachable, but incompatible with the methods used to find it? Modern investigation relies on consistency, reproducibility, agreement between independent systems, but the city existed only where systems disagreed. In overlapping errors, in misalignments, in contradictions. The moment an attempt was made to fix its location, the evidence dissolved. As though the act of searching imposed constraints the city could not or would not satisfy. By the time the final expedition concluded, the consensus was unspoken but clear. There was no way to find the city, not because it never existed, but because whatever rules once allowed it to exist no longer applied. The land had been normalized, the maps corrected, the records harmonized. What remained was a space where something had been removed so thoroughly that even absence left no mark. And yet, every attempt to search for the city left behind something else. Doubt, the quiet, unsettling sense that the city had not been destroyed or buried, but displaced into a version of reality we no longer had access to. A place that could not be reached, because it no longer belonged to the world that was looking for it. Chapter 5, Erased by Design. By the time investigators stopped trying to find the city, one question remained unavoidable. Cities do not erase themselves. For a place to vanish so completely, without ruins, without records, without memory, requires either an impossible coincidence or a deliberate process. Random loss cannot account for consistency. Neglect cannot explain coordination. Forgetting does not rewrite maps, alter archives, and reshape testimony in parallel. Something acted. The only uncertainty was intent. At first, the most rational explanations were considered. Governments have erased places before. Entire towns have been relocated for dams, weapons testing, or classified research. Maps have been altered, records sealed, witnesses silenced. But these operations leave patterns: declassified files, restricted zones, security perimeters, compensation records, environmental scars. Here there were none. No classified budgets, no land acquisition trails, no resettlement programs, no displaced populations appearing elsewhere. The city was not relocated, it was removed. Some researchers proposed the possibility of an administrative experiment, an extreme case of bureaucratic optimization, a decision to consolidate regions, simplify governance, or eliminate redundancy by absorbing a city into surrounding jurisdictions. But bureaucratic processes are slow and noisy. They generate paperwork, resistance, litigation. This erasure was silent, too precise, too complete. Others suggested a more unsettling possibility: that the city was erased to hide an event, an industrial accident, a biological incident, a containment failure. History offers examples of disasters concealed for decades, yet even secrecy leaves traces. Emergency responses ripple outward. Medical anomalies appear. Survivor populations exist. Here there were none. No spike in mortality, no migration wave, no unexplained illnesses. The city's population did not move. It vanished from accounting. That is when speculation began to shift away from physical explanations. What if the erasure was not about hiding something that happened in the city? What if the city itself was the problem? Some theorists propose that the city was part of a project, social, technological, or cognitive, that was never meant to persist. A controlled environment, a test population, a place designed to be temporary. But even experiments end messily. This ended cleanly, almost too cleanly. The deeper researchers looked, the more they noticed a disturbing symmetry. The city vanished from maps, witnesses vanished from records, the land vanished from certainty. Every system designed to stabilize reality rejected it. Cartography, administration, archival memory, geospatial technology, all corrected away the anomaly. This led to a more radical hypothesis. What if the erasure was automated? Not a decision made once, but a process that continuously enforced consistency. A system that identified contradictions and resolved them by removing whatever caused disagreement. In that framework, the city would not be destroyed because it was dangerous, but because it did not fit. It introduced complexity, ambiguity, unresolvable data, and systems built for order cannot tolerate that. The city became an error, and errors are corrected. This would explain why the erasure was gradual, why older records survived in fragments, why witnesses were not silenced, but slowly reclassified. No force, no violence, just normalization. But there is a darker interpretation still. What if the city resisted being known? Some physicists and philosophers have speculated about locations that cannot be fully observed, spaces that exist only under certain conditions, or collapse when measured too precisely. In such a scenario, the city's disappearance would not be imposed. It would be triggered. Each attempt to define it, to map it, catalog it, confirm it, would destabilize it further. The more it was acknowledged, the less it could exist. This would explain the paradoxes. Why small, informal references survived longer than official ones. Why local maps retained the city, while national maps erased it. Why personal memory outlasted administrative recognition. Attention destroyed it. Not suddenly, incrementally, until only absence remained. If this is true, then the city was not erased by force or conspiracy. It was erased by recognition. And recognition is relentless. Once a system decides that something does not belong, it will reshape reality until agreement is restored. The most unsettling aspect of this theory is what it implies. If a city can be removed because it disrupts coherence, then existence itself is conditional. Not on physical reality, but on compatibility. Places exist because they fit. People exist because they are documented. Histories exist because they align. Anything that refuses alignment becomes unstable, and instability invites correction, which raises a final, deeply uncomfortable question. Was the city unique, or was it simply the first to be noticed? How many other places have been smoothed out of reality because they complicated the map? How many contradictions have been resolved not by understanding, but by elimination? We assume that erasure requires intent, but what if it requires only indifference? A system does not need malice to destroy. It needs only rules, rules that prioritize clarity over truth, consistency over complexity, order over memory. In such a system, the city was never going to survive, not because it was dangerous, but because it could not be reconciled. And when reconciliation fails, erasure becomes the only remaining option. So was the city erased by design? Perhaps, but not by a single hand, not by a single decision. It was erased by a structure that could not allow it to exist. A structure that continues to operate, quietly correcting the world around us. Which means the city's disappearance was not an anomaly. It was a warning. A demonstration of what happens to anything that falls outside the shape of what can be agreed upon. A city that once had streets, people, and a name reduced to a contradiction, and then inevitably removed. The absence that remains. When the search finally ends, there is no revelation, no uncovered document that explains everything, no hidden photograph, no final witness. The city does not return. What remains is absence, and absence, unlike ruins, does not draw attention to itself. It blends into the landscape. It occupies space without announcing that anything is missing. Stand where the city is supposed to have been, and nothing feels wrong at first. The ground does not collapse. The air does not change. There is no sense of trespass. Birds move through the trees. Wind passes across the land. The world behaves as it always has. And yet the unease persists, because absence is not nothing. It is something removed so thoroughly that its outline becomes invisible. The city is not remembered as a place. It is remembered as a discrepancy, a misalignment between what once was recorded and what is now allowed to be known. Maps show nothing, but they show it with confidence. Records contradict one another, but only at the edges where attention fades. Memories survive only in fragments, stripped of authority and context. No one can point to the city, but no one can fully erase the sense that something should be there. This is the quiet aftermath of erasure, not destruction, not loss. Correction. The city has been resolved out of existence, its people redistributed into narratives that make more sense, its land reassigned to geography that raises fewer questions, its history reduced to anomalies labeled as errors. What is unsettling is not that the city is gone, it is how easily the world adjusted. There was no shock, no rupture, no visible moment of transition. Reality simply agreed. Agreed that the city had never been there. And once agreement was reached, the city ceased to matter. This is how erasure truly works, not through force, but through alignment. When enough systems converge on the same version of events, dissent becomes noise. Noise is filtered. Filtered data disappears. The city did not need to be hidden. It only needed to be incompatible. Even now, traces remain, though they are becoming harder to interpret. A line in an old ledger that points nowhere. A photograph with a caption that no longer resolves. A memory that cannot be verified. These remnants do not prove the city existed. They prove that something was removed, and removal leaves a different kind of mark. It leaves uncertainty, the kind that settles quietly into the background of knowledge, never quite demanding resolution, but never fully dissolving either. For most people, the story ends here. The city is filed away as a curiosity, a historical puzzle, an unresolved contradiction. But for those who have followed it closely, the city lingers, not as a place, but as a question. What determines what is allowed to exist? Is it physical presence, documentation, consensus? If a city can be erased without ruins, without survivors, without memory, then existence itself is fragile, dependent not on reality, but on recognition. The city no longer appears on maps. But maps are not neutral, they are agreements, and agreements can change. The city no longer exists in records, but records are edited, revised, corrected. The city no longer lives in memory, but memory bends under pressure. So where did the city go? Perhaps nowhere. Perhaps it is still exactly where it always was, occupying a space that our systems no longer acknowledge, a place that exists only outside of alignment. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thought of all, because it means the city was not destroyed, it was excluded from the version of the world we share. And if exclusion can erase a city, what else has been quietly removed? What else has fallen between versions of reality because it complicated the picture? What else have we agreed not to see? The absence remains, not as a scar, but as a gap too smooth to notice. And as long as we trust the systems that corrected it, the city will stay gone, unvisited, unproven, unremembered, not lost, but erased.
Shadows crawl where the light won't go, a silent wind, it starts to grow.